Hello there, this is the first of 4 talks I want to give on contemplation as I see it. They're entitled Contemplation. It's simple, but it's not easy. What is contemplation? Well, the word prayer that the Bible uses became cheapened and trivialized in the early centuries of the church. Because in the year 3013, Constantine won his battles, and he embraced the church and in a sense nationalised it for the empire. And Christianity became the mainline faith, and as someone once called it, it became like fast food religion. Everyone was into it. God's on our side. Prayer changed and became a much more functional and problem-solving thing. It was about making announcements to God, telling God what you needed, and getting God to do things for you, to put it crudely. I was sat around the table a few months ago with a few people, and one guy was going to go on holiday the following week. And he says, the weather forecast is terrible. I don't know what it's going to be like. And somebody else said, well, the weather's not good. Well, claim it and make it so. Well, that's a rather extreme way of regarding prayer, making God do things for our benefit. So in these early centuries, when faith had become cheapened and trivialized, there was a strain of people who wanted to go deeper and recapture what Jesus actually was teaching. And they went off into the deserts of Egypt, Palestine, Syria and Turkey. And this movement became what we call the monastic movement. Before Constantine, Christians were persecuted and killed for their faith. And those who died were called martyrs. And this sort of martyrdom was often called red martyrdom, clearly because of the blood that was spilt. But then once the church had entered this new, rather victorious phase, St. Jerome coined a different phrase called white martyrdom. And this was for those such as desert hermits who aspired martyrdom through strict asceticism. They wanted to go deeper by asking, what was Jesus really talking about when he talked about prayer? So they started to use a different word. They used the word contemplation. This is not so much saying prayers. It is not thinking what to say. It is more about living in constant union with God and all creation and the entire universe. Not only is it a different way of praying, it's a different way of thinking, it's a different consciousness, it's a different way of being, is probably a better way of putting it. So Jesus said, I and the Father are one. Well, I grew up in a good Christian sort of family and church environment, and I was taught to be a good Christian at school, wherever I went. And I was told, always remember Jesus throughout the day. Well, that's a little bit difficult when you're playing football on a field as a 9-year-old boy and people foul you. It's hard to keep thinking about Jesus. I didn't know quite how to do that. In Philippians 4, St. Paul says, pray always. Is that what he meant? It cannot mean going around all the time verbalizing or thinking words to say to God or to Jesus. Rather, I believe it meant that everything we do, everything we are, needs to be a prayer in whatever we're doing. We can probably assume that Jesus never talked really much about verbal prayer because his disciples came to him and said, well, teach us to pray. John's taught his disciples, teach us. So Jesus' form of prayer in the desert is what we'd call contemplative prayer, more lived than thought. So we need to rewire the mind somehow, or St. Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of our minds, so that everything we do, not just think or say, is a loving union with the moment, with this moment, with whatever is right in front of you. It might be something great. It might be something quite difficult. It might be on a city street. It might be on a mountain top. It might be while sat in your lounge. It might be while sat in a prisoner's cell with him. It might be when a baby is born. It might be by the bed of someone who is dying. Contemplation is about finding that union with the life that is God in this moment. So one exercise which is used to help us get into contemplation, which I find very difficult, is to sit in silence. What happens to you when you sit in silence? Stuff goes in this side and comes out this side. I'm pulled into arguments, emotions, feelings, hurts, agendas. I'm thinking about something someone else said and I start to become defensive in here. And we have to practice getting out of our heads so that we can live more centrally in our being. Usually we're non-contemplative, or to put it another way, we live with the dualistic mind. With the dualistic mind, we tend to think in this and that, good and bad, black and white, true and false, men and women, Brexit or not Brexit. Oh, the list could go on. And we take a position and we defend it, all with these labels that we have for these different positions that we take. We'd rather win and keep our position defended than actually have it lost. That is dualistic thinking. The contemplative mind doesn't do that. 50 years ago, the monk Thomas Merton was very critical of the monks that were in his monastery. And he said, they're not contemplating when they sit in the chapel in silence. He said they're introverting. He said that in a sense we have lost the art of contemplation throughout our history, although it is there throughout the history of the church. And things like the Reformation, for the benefits it may have brought in terms of some theology, actually kept us in the dualistic mind, because suddenly Protestants were right and Catholics were wrong, although they thought the opposite. So we couldn't be contemplative because we were stuck in the either or dualistic mind, and we wanted to be triumphant in our thinking in being right. So it said, once you are fighting for a position, you are no longer contemplative, you're dualistic. You have to choose sides, you have to prove you're right. So debating society is very much skillless in this way of approaching life. If we don't discover the contemplative mind, a number of modern day prophets have said, we will never be an alternative to Western civilization. On the whole, Christians have most of the prejudices of all the people they live with and live among. I found this definition of contemplation quite helpful. Contemplation is a long, loving look at what is real. St. Paul says, Christ is in all and Christ is all. Everything that we see and have around us is infused with the life of Christ. In him we live and move and have our being. So contemplation is able to take us to a place where we can gaze at something for that sense of reality that is there, without having to make a judgment about it, without having to critique it or analyse it, say whether it's good or whether it's bad, say will it make me money or not make me money, will I like it, will I dislike it. We just look at it for what it is. Once we do that, we've started to contemplate. As I say at the beginning, it's so simple, it's hard to teach. We have been brought up with other ways of praying, like with the acronym ACTS: adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication, which is good. But unless we take ourselves to this other place of contemplation, these other forms of prayer are in danger of actually being a prayer from the ego. If we do make this move, we no longer need to win. We don't need to make people agree with us. We can offer people what we have within us, and it's okay if they don't take it and even reject it. We won't become offended. And the Spirit says, we don't know how to pray, but the Spirit prays through us with unutterable groans. For a number of years I worked as a prison chaplain, and one of our jobs was we were expected to pray with the prisoners, which was great. And in one unit, which was the isolation unit, prisoners couldn't meet with others. And often they'd ask for the chaplain, can I see the chaplain? So I would go down there, and there's a little room, and they take the prisoner in, put him behind the glass screen, lock the door. Then I go and sit the other side of the glass screen, and I would talk with him. And we would talk for a while, 20 minutes or so. And eventually I would say, well, shall we pray? Oh, yeah, we'll pray. I said, we'll do it like this. I'll say a very short prayer, and then we will sit in silence. So I'd say, here's my hand on the glass, you put your hand on the glass. And we would sit with our hand on the window. I would say the prayer, and then we'd sit in the quiet. Well, as quiet as it could be in a prison. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Quite often, or maybe usually, the prisoner on the other side of this window would just weep. And eventually I'd finish our prayers, take my hand off, and I'd say, are you okay? And he would go, that's one of the best things that's happened to me for a long time. That sense of me taking an interest, but him, I believe, sensing something of the presence of the life of God who is in all things, even in an isolation unit in a high security prison. We are desperate for union in these times of the COVID virus. People just want to talk or touch each other, and yet we're not allowed to do that. One of our programs we watch on television is the program called Long Lost Family, about people who get back in touch with the mother or the father they never met because they were put up for adoption. Or people find out actually they had brothers or sisters they didn't know about. And when they meet for the first time, every time these people throw their arms around each other. They just need to touch the other person and participate a bit in their life and they in theirs. It's a magical moment. And they say it's something to the effect that it's someone I've always belonged to but didn't quite know it within. There was something missing, but I didn't quite know it. And now I know I belong to them and they belong to me. So, contemplation. St. Paul said he'd learnt the secret. He'd learnt the secret how to be content in all situations. And I think it's to do with contemplation. It didn't matter whether he was in prison or not, whether actually things were going well for him, or whether people opposed him or not. He was still able to meet the Christ who is in all things and is all things. The saints used to talk about these two forms of praying. There's what they called the cataphatic, which is actually we pray about what we know. We pray with words and symbols and ideas. We formulate them and we say our prayers. That's the cataphatic way of praying. But they also said too, there's an apophatic way of praying that has no content. It can feel empty because God is not just in our senses, but beyond our senses. God is beyond our dreams. God is beyond all of our words. God is beyond all of the names we give to God. God is beyond all time. It can be speaking in tongues. It can be the groans of St. Paul. It's like lovers being together who don't talk but still make noises. You know what I mean. The desert fathers and the desert mothers learnt to pray this other way of actually participating and being there in the moment, there with the Christ who is in all things. A friend of mine a couple of years ago was involved in a church and the whole thing badly went wrong. And he said, we had long chats about it, and he says something completely fascinating. He said, as someone who has always previously prayed spontaneously with words, i.e. cataphatic, I have now run out of words, the apophatic. And normally I think the case is that actually we go through some struggle or difficulty where we find that actually what we know in terms of prayer is just not enough. And we slip into and we find this other way of finding God in all things. So there we are. Contemplation. So what happens in your head when you sit still? It'll be like my head on the whole. Loads of stuff goes on. But can I find a place where in fact I am more in the moment than in my head? As another friend of mine says, we spend too much time in the attic. And if you go up into the attic, take someone with you. I find that cycling down to the coast where I live, on my bicycle by myself, I can slip into the moment, just slowly pedalling along with the breeze and sometimes a little bit of rain, just in that moment. I find it hard just by myself. If I sit with other people, I find that really helpful. Maybe going for a walk, maybe just sat on a seat somewhere, maybe in a park or even the countryside, and just slipping into this moment and spending less time churning it all around in my head. Contemplation. It's simple, but it's not easy.